Good morning and good afternoon from wherever you join us today. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islands people present today. So today joining us, my name is Heath McDonald. I'm one of the RPAS team leaders within the operations branch in CASA. We have Rowan Kimber, who is acting manager for RPAS policy and regulation, and we'll hand over to him shortly. And we're also joined by Amy Carter, who is our RPAS policy support coordinator, and will be moderating our Q&A session later. So what are we going to speak about today? So a bit of a background and overview of the actual project itself. We're going to discuss what is a sample manual and also the guide, the construct of the new sample manual, key changes to the new manual, the ReOC, and also the night instrument, use of digital compliance tools, and some Q&A time for you to send your questions through. On the screen there, you'll see the RPAS webinar email address. If you do have any questions, you can start sending them through now, and also throughout the actual session. Please feel free to send that through, and we'll attempt to answer, see if we can answer most questions today. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge though and thank your industry representative bodies, so the Australian Association for Uncrewed Systems, AAOS, and the Australian Certified UAV Operators, ACUO, for their review and their feedback throughout the development of this manual, which has been crucial to the success, hopefully, of this manual. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to my colleague Rowan, who was instrumental in the development of this manual, and he will take you through the remaining talking points today. Thank you. And Rowan, I think you're actually on mute there still, the old Teams trick.
Well, it's nothing better than starting a webinar on mute. Thanks so much for that, Heath.
And it's not like we'll put on YouTube either, so
yeah,
over to
absolutely.
you. Thanks.
Thanks. And thanks, Heath, and thanks everyone who's taken the time out of their busy schedules to learn more about the new RPAS sample manual. Ultimately, this is a webinar about a document, so we'll keep it as thrilling as possible. In all seriousness, though, there's been some key changes to regulations, and today's content's relevant even if you're an operator that doesn't plan to change to the new manual. Before I get into the specifics of the new manual, there's some important background information that I'd like to cover. As you can see up on the slide there, all ReOC holders must have suitable documented practices and procedures, and that's in our regulations. So the purpose of documented practices and procedures is to provide a comprehensive set of policies, guidelines and information specific to the operator's drone operations so that an acceptable level of safety can be met. The form and the content of documented practices and procedures isn't prescribed in our regulations. Most operators adopt an operations manual as the core document to the suite. The content of an operations manual will depend on the size and the complexity of the operator, and I'm going to come back to that quite a few times today. A suitable manual should have content around organisational structure, duties and responsibilities, risk mitigation, normal and abnormal operating procedures, and aircraft fitness to fly. And that's not an all-inclusive list. Your documented practices and procedures need to be fit for your particular operation. And so when CASA receives a new or significantly modified manual, a review is conducted by an RPAS inspector to determine the manual suitability. So how does the new manual fit in? Well, firstly, it provides guidance to operators on what would be considered acceptable procedures to meet the suitability requirement for a low complexity operator. The sample manual also serves as a foundation upon which operators can incorporate further documented practices and procedures. While there's some good reasons to move to the new manual, such as increased efficiency when submitting content to CASA, it's not compulsory and the new manual is not for everyone. The manual was developed by CASA with the support of AAUS and ACUO. None of those involved in drafting know the intricacies of your operation in the way that you do. Your manual should always reflect the way that you do things. This is particularly relevant as operators become more complex. While the manual provides, as I said, a good framework for the development of documented practices and procedures, in its current form, it's not suitable for a highly complex operator. I note that this is by design. Complex operators must have a sufficient knowledge of their operations to meet their safety obligations. This extends to being able to articulate these complexities and the necessary safety mitigators in their operations manual. It's not to say the manual shouldn't be used by complex operators, but there's more work to be done if you fit into this category. Ultimately, it's up to each operator to determine the appropriateness of the sample operations manual for their specific needs. CASA provides this tool, but again, it is the operator's decision on how and if they utilise it. For new entrants to the industry, it's a particularly useful tool. I should note that for operators utilising the 2017 or the 2020 CASA template, it's entirely appropriate for you to continue using your existing manuals, obviously with any necessary updates to ensure that your documentation reflects present regulation. You may, however, want to incorporate some of the 2023 content into the older manuals to gain some of the benefits from recent regulatory changes. And just while I'm on this, the manuals can also be used in the new form by the delegates as well, so that's already ready to go. So the manual is designed to closely align with CASA's templates for crewed aviation, and it's a reasonable departure from our previous versions. This approach ensures consistency in CASA's oversight of manuals across different sectors. The change in layout has also resulted in a more concise manual with improved readability. This is particularly important for new entrants. There's some key changes I'd like to talk about with the manual. We don't have time to go through the entire manual, but the 4 hot topics we've got are the new manual amendment processes, updates to the risk methodology, simplification of record keeping, and consolidation of operational procedures. So we'll start with the change to amendment procedures and the significant versus non-significant changes. Now, I should say these apply to all operators, not just operators using the new manual. For some operators, they need to look at the content that they've got in their manual and make some changes on the back of recent changes to the manual of standards. So for those who have been following reg developments, they'll know that there's a definition now included in the manual of standards that defines significant change. And I've actually got an extract of that here. I'm not going to read the entire extract, but I'll just point to a couple of items here. So a significant change for certified operator, and if you have a look at the highlighted section, is a change that does not maintain or improve or is not likely to maintain or improve aviation safety, and then it references certain items such as RPA operations, operational risks, fatigue. There's a bit in there, and it's worth every operator to go back and have a look at that so they understand what changes are significant change and what are non-significant changes. The relevance is when you change your documented practices and procedures in particular. So under our new system, if you're making a change to your documented practices and procedures that is not a significant change, so something that doesn't fall on that list, you don't need to wait for CASA approval before you do it. That's because the very nature of these changes are designed to improve the safety of your operations, and there shouldn't be a hesitation moment when an operator wants to improve their safety. And so with any of these changes, all you need to do is fill out a significant, non-significant change form. So there's a little picture of the form there on the screen. You can download that from the CASA website. Fill in the form, make a declaration that your change is a non-significant change, send it off to CASA within 21 days of making that change. And that's going to include a copy of the changed documented practices and procedures. For significant changes, you can't make these unless there've been prior approval from CASA. And so what you need to do with your significant change is create the draft content that's going to be in your documented practices and procedures, fill out the significant change form detailing what the significant change is, send that into CASA, and that'll run through our normal operations manual review process. Now, CASA is obligated for certain items to charge for it. There's a cost recovery model through the Australian government, and so certain items will be charged for, and we'll be estimating those if it's a chargeable action. The last bullet point I've got on the slide is about a approval of a significant change not being an instrument of approval. And this is a really important point we've seen in the past with operators misunderstanding that when you put something in your operations manual and that's accepted by CASA, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's an express approval to do that particular function. And so something like a BVLOS approval, if you're applying for BVLOS, the SIG non-SIG isn't the correct way to do that. It's going to be going through the normal form process. So your 10109 or your EVLOS form, your multi-purpose form to get an instrument of approval. If the regulations require you to get a approval or permission from CASA under, for instance, 101.080, then you'll still need to go through that process. All right, continuing on with the theme of manual changes. Next up is the removal of Schedule 1. And obviously the cameras are off and the mics are off, so I can't hear everyone in the room. But for those existing operators, I'm assuming there's some cheers that have gone up because we've removed Schedule 1. There's a bit of work that's gone into this, quite a lot of risk assessment around our decision to take out Schedule 1. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about, since 2017, all ReOCs have included 3 general conditions, and they're up on the screen there. 2 of those conditions were the inclusion of a Schedule 1 to the operations manual. That's now gone. So as of June the 16th, all new and renewed ReOCs only have 1 condition, also on the screen there. And this new condition is to maintain a list of the makes and models of each RPA operated in the operations manual. And so we no longer need to keep a list of the numbers of the RPA. That's gone. For existing operators, we've drafted this new condition in a way that ensures that when you do get your new ReOC through, if you've got your old Schedule 1, you'll remain compliant. However, for people who are moving to the new manual who haven't updated their ReOC, they won't be compliant anymore because the old condition specifically said you needed to have Schedule 1. Not to worry, CASA is at no cost issuing new ReOC, reissuing the existing ReOC with the new conditions to people upon application. So if you're moving to the new manual, let us know that you need a new ReOC, and at that point, so long as it's just a PDF version and not a mail out paper version, then there's no cost to change over to have the new conditions on. On to risk methodology. CASA's regulatory approach is increasingly focused on outcomes and adopts a risk-based perspective. As part of this, CASA recently released Booklet 9 as an addition to the Safety Management Systems Guidance Kit. And this booklet specifically addresses SMS for RPAS. And anyone who's interested, that QR code will take you directly to that book. CASA strongly encourages operators to adopt a formal safety management system. That said, at this stage, safety management systems remain optional for an RPAS operator. That doesn't mean you don't have to have risk management though. It's crucial that operators have some form of risk management methodology to meet the suitability requirements of the regulation for your documented practices and procedures. The sample manual continues to include a risk assessment requirement, and the tools for addressing risk are substantially similar to the previous templates. That said, the risk methodology detailed in the manual has been clarified to better align with Booklet 9. The manual now expressly refers to the operator maintaining a generic risk register that covers the type of operations conducted by the operator. It also has mandatory triggers where you must update your risk register. These include significant changes to the types of operations and also when you have a safety occurrence. Day-to-day management of risk for the target audience is largely through regulatory requirements, including the standard operating conditions. The job safety assessment, however, continues to be a valuable tool for risk management. There has been a significant change, though, when it comes to the job safety assessment. We've removed the requirement to complete an expanded written JSA for every operation. Under the new system, operations in very small RPA that could be conducted under the excluded category no longer are required to do an expanded JSA. This change is risk-based and ensures that an operator's decision to operate under a ReOC in lieu of the excluded category does not impose an unreasonable burden. While I'm talking about the JSA, you'll notice a change in the form of the operational and maintenance records in the manual. This was facilitated by minor tweaks to the Manual of Standards. The operational records, including planning, authorization, pre-flight and logging have been consolidated into a single document that encompasses all relevant information for the specific operation. And that's this one at the top here, what we call a flight record. The RPAS technical log has been revised to resemble a maintenance release form that's used in crewed aviation. So that's the one on the bottom. This modification simplifies the record keeping requirements outlined in the MOS and represents, importantly, a step towards certified RPA operations. Of note with this document is a move towards a daily inspection and certification of serviceability. As was the case in the 2020 sample manual, company form templates are contained in an appendice for easy navigation. If you go through the manual, you'll notice that there's a bunch of placeholders in the forms appendix. These are suggested forms that will need to be developed by the operator. CASA has, at this stage, opted not to provide templates for all of the records that are likely required by the operator. This is because the forms are likely to touch other areas of the business, such as human resources, and many operators will already have systems implemented to manage these functions. The guide that accompanies the manual provides further details on the possible content and legislative requirements for their records. It's worth noting that, as with the rest of the manual, the operator and all operators should ensure that the forms they use are fit for purpose. Some operators will develop forms aligned with the suggested headings. Others will keep information in different repositories. The important thing is that the operator has a documented mechanism for meeting record keeping requirements and that these processes are clearly conveyed to crew. Other changes. We've removed the requirement to keep copies of instruments in the manual. This was a bit of a burden in the past, particularly for operators who had an instrument that would last for a weekend. And so they would have to put the instrument in their manual before the weekend, and then at the end of the weekend, take that instrument back out to make sure their manual was compliant. So the removal of this is part of a wider change towards a better document libraries for operators and removing unnecessary administration. In the same vein, we've removed the requirement to duplicate content from the RPA user manuals into the operations manual. And for those who have used the 2017 version of the manual would be well aware about duplication of content. We've moved a long way since then. User manuals are much better. Details that are coming from manufacturers are much better. Checklists are much better. Under the new manual, only custom procedures and differences from the manufacturer's instructions need to be contained in the specific manual. The final item I'd like to talk about is the removal of specific prescriptive controls from the manual for low complexity operations. This is based on an expansion of the operational rules in Part 101, the MOS, and also a greater depth of mandatory knowledge requirements in remote pilot training. And probably not to be understated is the fact that the industry continues to mature. For low risk operations that fall outside of standard operating conditions, such as operations near controlled aerodromes, CASA's current policy is to include specific mitigating measures in the relevant instrument of approval. In the past, the manual has duplicated these conditions. The new manual eliminates this duplication by better incorporating the instrument conditions. The removal of prescriptive requirements extends to night operations. These changes have prompted an amendment to CASA Instrument 0117, which is going to be released in the near future. So operators who have been conducting night operations under CASA 0117 would be familiar with the link between the instrument and the content specifically of the 2017 version of the ops manual. And so the 2020 version of the ops manual duplicated the night content out of the 2017 because this was the approved content under the 0117 instrument. With the aim of adopting a risk-centric approach, we've begun transitioning night operations to allow an operator to determine the appropriate mitigating measures for their specific operations. In the 2017 template, mitigating measures were included in the manual that went beyond those outlined in the Schedule 2 of the instrument. These additional mitigators have been removed from the manual. It is now the responsibility of the operator to determine the necessary mitigating measures in addition to those specifically listed in Schedule 2 of the instrument. This change reflects the ongoing maturity of the industry again, and a move to CASA's outcome-based regulatory approach. As I mentioned earlier, in line with a risk-based philosophy, as the complexity of operations increase, so will the requirement for and the extent of standard operating procedures. The guidance material on CASA's website provides draft content to assist operators conducting the more common operational types that fall outside the standard operating conditions. And this is one of the key functions of the guide that accompanies the manual. CASA will continue to put templates in there for operations that are appropriate to do so. However, where content is not available or not appropriate, it's expected that an operator will create relevant content that is fit for purpose. So we're going to be conducting a post-implementation review. January 2024 is what we've got scheduled for it. We're going to look at the manual and consider relevant feedback that's come in over the next 6 months, with a view to refining the sample manual as needed. The guide, we're expecting to update that more frequently, and that's as we have more templated procedures and things become more standardized. I strongly encourage people to provide feedback on both the manual and the guide. The documents can only be as good as the feedback we get, and the email address is on the screen there, rpas.pac@casa.gov.au for feedback. I'll hand over to Amy to start the question component. We've got some time here, and we'll see where we wrap up from there. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Rowan. Firstly, for your presentation today, and secondly, for all of your efforts that went into developing a manual that we hope aligns with industry's needs, whilst also balancing the fine line with the regulatory requirements. We have had a number of emails come through. Thank you to those who have submitted a question. So we'll start with you, Rowan. How does the manual work if I'm using software to manage my ReOC?
Great question. So CASA has for a long time now and continues to support digital compliance software. Data is key in safety these days, the more the better. And so we continue to support that. There are some changes that you'll need to make to the manual if you're using digital compliance software, just around the record keeping locations and the forms. They're not particularly big changes. Have a look through the manual. There's 6 instances, I think, by memory, about that refer to document storage locations. They'll need to be updated to reflect the compliance software, and the forms will need to be changed.
Great. Thank you, Rowan. Heath, I'll throw to you next. If I transition to the new manual, does this mean it will be a significant change?
Thanks, Amy. The easy answer is no. But to explain it a little bit more, so if you do choose it or decide that you want to transition to the new template, as long as you do not change your current procedures and you essentially, let's say, copy and paste, carbon copy, whatever your procedures are from your current manual into the new manual, this will be considered a non-significant change. You will still fill out the form, submit it through to CASA. We don't necessarily assess this non-significant change, but we will take note of that, and we'll also file that in your file to keep it on record. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Heath. Similar topic, so I'll go to you again, Heath. If an instrument of approval is issued and added to permissions in the appendix of the manual, would this be considered a significant change or a non-significant change?
So I'll also lean on Rowan here as well, if he's got anything more to add. But there's probably 2 parts of it. One, the approval itself could, I guess, enact a significant change if you were required to change procedures or anything like that. However, it's using the new manual, you're not required to actually keep the appendix 2 or in the old template. So therefore, if you use a new manual, you don't actually you're not required to place in the instruments of approval, the authorizations, anything that you receive in the actual manual. You must just keep a record of them. If you're using the old manual, that is still a requirement. However, that will be deemed a non-significant change in accordance with the form that we've created, which is fairly straightforward and fairly easy to understand. Rowan, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, no, look, I think you covered it well there, Heath. When you have a look through the new manual, what you'll notice is there's a real big shift towards an operator keeping a library of documents that is not necessarily in the manual. And this is to try and reduce that administration issue of sending things back and forth to CASA all the time. We're all big enough and old enough these days to be able to manage our documents properly. And so the new manual creates a system so that you can manage those document repositories yourself. And instruments of approval are one of those things that you can manage yourself without having to put into the manual and then take out a couple of days later when they go out.
Great. Thank you for clarifying. Rowan, this one's for you. Is paper-based record keeping still acceptable?
Absolutely. Why not? Look, to be honest, I don't care if people use a chisel and stone for their record keeping, so long as they keep it. CASA is a big fan of digital document keeping, particularly where an operator uses that data as part of their business improvement processes. In saying that, for the purposes of the MOS, the important bit is that you keep the records. If you do keep them as a paper-based copy or as a chisel and stone copy, you'll just need to update those 6 references that were in the manual. They'll need to be updated to say where and also how you keep the paper-based records.
Thank you, Rowan. Another one for you, Rowan. What about BARS compliance and inclusion of the content inside the new CASA manual?
It's a super duper good question, and thank you. I had a feeling that the gentleman who sent that was going to send that question. Look, I thought a lot about this when we were creating the document, and it was actually in our original version of this presentation. I mentioned it there are some good reasons to use this manual. There may be some reasons that it doesn't work for you, and one of those could be that this manual doesn't fit within other areas of the business that it touches. And if you're one of those complicated businesses or operators that involves other things like the BAR standard or other complicated document management procedures, this might not be the right manual for you. In saying that, it's a skeleton. It was intentionally built as a skeleton that meets the suitability requirements for a low risk. But for those more complex operations, I dare say that the skeleton could probably work pretty well to be able to expand it out to some of those other operations.
Thank you, Rowan. Okay, and just more clarification. Does a ReOC holder have to transition to the new manual? Heath?
Yeah, so look, it follows on some of what Rowan just mentioned as well. And the decision is really upon the ReOC itself, if they wish to transition or not. The sample manual is not something that is mandatory, is not something that you must have. You could essentially create your own manual. What it's designed to do is make it easier for both us and yourselves to present an acceptable document suite. So the answer to the question is no. There are advantages of taking up the new manual, given what was discussed today around changes to the ReOC, some changes to the night operations and some streamlining of approvals where sort of very low risk operations, similar to trying to bridge the gap with, let's say, excluded sub 2 kilo commercial operations. So there is advantages of transitioning, but is definitely not a compulsory or requirement to transition to that.
Thank you for clarifying that, Heath. That actually looks to be all the questions that we've received today. So I'm going to hand back over to you, Heath.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Appreciate that. Look, I would just like to say thanks to everyone who joined us today. I'd also like to thank you, Amy, for moderating the session, and also Rowan for all your efforts that have gone into this. And I hope that we collectively have produced a manual that really addresses the industry needs. So please note, we do have the rpas.pack@casa.gov.au email. Please send through feedback continually. We do want to know what is working, what isn't working, and hopefully we can take all that and develop that and refine this manual. The intent is not to have this manual redrafted and rewritten within the next 3 years. We want to see this stand the test of time and use the guide to really drive change that can be applied to the manual. So back to Rowan's comment on the skeleton approach, that's our approach here. Once again, thank you all, and we hope you have a great day.
There has been one last minute question come in if we want to see if we can handle it. Heath, sorry, you've done a crackingly good job wrapping it up.
Over to you,
Okay,
Rowan.
and it's a question that I probably shouldn't have stopped for today. It was, what's the position on operating sub 250 grams on the ReOC? And I might take that, if that's all right, Heath, from a policy perspective. CASA is revisiting what's happening with micro RPA, particularly with ReOCs. It's something that we're looking at the moment. Everything we do is a risk-based approach, and obviously when we make changes to the civil aviation safety regulations, it's a pretty rigorous process that we need to go through with government. So we are looking at it, and you'll get more information in due course as we tackle that issue. But rest assured, the micro RPA ability to operate on the ReOC is something we're well aware of.
Excellent. And I'll call it there for any further questions. But if you do have any further questions, please feel free to send them through to RPAS Pack, as well as your feedback. Thanks again for today. See you later.